Hello and welcome to a new edition of PUBCAST for Labour Social. I'm here with Johnny Reynolds, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, and Andrew Gwynne, who is the Shadow Minister for Public Health. And we are in Jack's Bar here in Hyde, in Greater Manchester. Are we part of Greater Manchester?
This is part of Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham is the mayor, so you've got that right. You have to send you to Merseyside and punish you for saying that. But
in old money, it was Cheshire.
We're in old money, yes. This is people often mistake bits of my constituency as historically being Lancashire.
Not Cheshire.
Cheshire.
But Mosley was.
Mosley is actually where the three counties met, and we still have a road. So the West Riding.
Yeah.
Lancashire, Cheshire, that's where Mosley, that's in my patch.
Oh, wow.
But here, Hyde and Staley Bridge with Cheshire.
Oh, fantastic.
So welcome, Graham.
Thank you to your patch, your turf. Yep. So we've had a bit of a crazy week, haven't we, in politics? But that's not saying much, because
I was going to say, tell me a week
13 years have just been a non-stop nightmare.
They have. I mean, so this is for Andrew and I, obviously, is a constituency day for us. We've been doing the things, the bit that actually makes the job really nice. Getting around, and that's what kind of feeds you up for the week. But sometimes you can't quite believe the week that you've had, and that has been very much like this week. And sometimes they feel like the week has gone on for a month when you come back and look at it. But yeah, this grounding experience and a chance to reflect. What can you say?
But we say that every week, don't we? Because every week is just more bizarre than the previous one. It's absolutely crazy politics at the moment.
This week has been absolutely dominated by Gary Lineker's comments on Twitter on Tuesday, and every day since then, the headlines in the gutter press have been, how dare he, how dare he? And I'm looking at this thinking, hang on, Alan Sugar, he does The Apprentice, doesn't he? And he puts whatever he likes on Twitter. But then hang on, Andrew Neil, who was doing the main politics show on the BBC, edited The Spectator. I'm just like, how? What? It's just...
I also think, Graham, often it feels like the people who go on about cancel culture do seem to be the people who want.
They're quite keen on cancelling people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I say Gary Lineker was a childhood hero of mine, Italian 90. Penny Morden comparing us to Gary Lineker, I don't really think is an insult when it's one of the country's all-time greatest.
He won the Golden Boot in
England
Mexico
players.
in 1986.
I think one of the things that that feels very much to me is that this is I will always accept sometimes when say a government or the other side does something that I disagree with, we'll have that political row. I don't think what we've seen this week, I don't think the government think they're fixing the problem. I think they're trying to create a row. It's in other words, the politics is the result. It's not the byproduct of a difference of view. The kind of sense of controversy they're trying to. That is it. And I think actually people do see through that more than in. I think people. I don't think anyone, even in the Conservative Party, thinks they are going to fix the problem of illegal immigration. I think what they want to do is say that they, somehow were prevented from doing it. I mean, they've got an 80-seat majority. They've been in power 13 years, so really, they don't really have that many limitations on what they want to do.
This is all about the politics.
Yeah,
that is all it's about, because Sunak doesn't have to deliver this side of a general election. But what he wants to do is to hold firm on the red wall seats that Johnson got in 2019. And part of that, they know, is immigration. It's a valid concern of many in those constituencies, using the kind of rhetoric, Trumpian rhetoric, about lefty lawyers. I mean, we heard him say that about Keir at PMQs, and this is the start of a big row leading up to the general election, why everybody is against this plan. We're going to stop something that certainly their plans aren't going to really address.
But they made this happen. First, to be specific, we're talking about small boats and the fact that people are coming over to Britain in small boats. Before 2018, no one was coming over here in small boats. The Conservatives made this problem, and now they're like, hey, that problem we made, we're going to solve it. But it's exactly the same thing they said 1 year ago under Priti Patel.
Well, exactly. The format is this. I mean, I did an interview this week, and it was like, deja vu. So if you think about the Rwanda scheme, it was, we're going to do something to fix this problem. The do-gooders won't like it, the left won't like it, but it's going to fix the problem. Yeah. And here we are with an exactly the same thing. I don't know anyone who thought Rwanda, given that no one really has gone there.
I've been there.
But you weren't forced by the government and then forced to live there. You were allowed back into the UK. Great. And again, I do think people see through it. I mean, we often say we're bits of the red wall that are still red, and I think concern about illegal immigration. It is a concern.
Yeah.
But how do we fix that? Well, it's there's a huge criminal gang element to this.
You've got to crush the gangs.
Yeah.
And that takes international cooperation.
Yeah. And a website. I brought over some Ukrainian refugees last year from the border with Poland. We had Ukrainian refugees stay with us in Durham, and they could apply online. Yeah. If you're from Hong Kong, or if you're from Afghanistan, or if you're from Ukraine, you can apply online. Yeah. But no one else can. I'm like, so that would destroy the criminal enterprise. It'd be like legalizing heroin. It would stop all the heroin dealers.
But you've got to process the claims as well. I mean, that is, as people who do casework, immigration casework, we don't have anything like, I'd say, maybe colleagues in city centres or London have, but the Home Office's performance on how many claims are processed, how long people wait, it is ridiculous. You have people in touch with you for years, really. Yeah. And if the government isn't willing to do that hard bit, that's what I said on the media this week. The one thing they never threaten is basic competence to fix the problem. Because but isn't that if you have to work out who should be in this country, who shouldn't be, you have to be willing to do that. And 2% of the claims made last year have been processed.
I thought it was 1%. I thought it was less than, because it was 4.
It's 1% for people from Albania specifically, and 2% of
Yeah, no, they and Sunak said it at PMQs, they are delighted that they have massively increased on the 4. It's now 21.
It's also, you hear this point about people not being allowed. We're not going to let them claim asylum. Well, okay, so what are you going to do with them? Because we heard that before. The last immigration bill said they'd take out, I think, 18,000 people's eligibility to claim. Yeah. If you haven't got the return agreements in place, working with your European partners, neighbours.
And you've torn up Dublin 2, which said that you could return them to the first safe country in the EU.
Yeah. They're in hotels. Yes. And that's the problem. It's no good for them. It's not right. But it's also, it's not what the country wants.
Rwanda, it was going to be £1 million per refugee. You could just put them in $1 million house in £1 million house in the UK, but then the Sun would lose their minds, on the Express and the Mail. But do you feel like, as Labour MPs, I find this frustrating as someone on the outside. You must find this just on another level of infuriating.
We get criticised for opposing bad legislation in Parliament that didn't work because we've had immigration bill after immigration bill after immigration bill.
But if you had supported the Tories, it would have worked. I said they've got an 80-seat majority. What do they care?
Because they're 80-seat majority, exactly. Yeah. That's the point. That by their own admission, by the measures they're bringing forward, they have failed. So in other words, they are validated.
But each time they up the rhetoric, they up the ante, and it's all about having a political row. It's not about solving the problem.
Yeah. I think it's similar to, in a sense, the strikes, the industrial action we've seen, which is, I don't think people want to fix it. I think they've tried to use that as an alibi for the poor state of public services rather than get down, negotiate. The fact is, when inflation's double digit, people are really struggling. Of course, they need that recognised in their pay settlement, and most people are willing. They just want to talk. You saw, I think, before Christmas, the nurses who basically never go on strike, never have, 106 years. This government took them to the brink. They were willing to actually call off any industrial action just for negotiations, and the government didn't want that at the time.
But the consequence of that, Johnny, is that 10,000 operations were cancelled, delayed, and the government has eventually done what it could have done in December and avoided all of that. And that's what's frustrating. If they know they're going to come to some kind of compromise, and we all knew that was what was going to be done at some stage.
How else do disputes end?
Little known fact, when Thatcher got in 1979, she paid off the workers who were striking. She gave them a pay rise above inflation to stop them. Very socialist, Margaret Thatcher, though.
This is the first time I've heard you speak favourably about Margaret Thatcher in that sense.
Edit this bit. Edit. But it's just fascinating. She looks now positively left-wing compared with the Yahoos.
That's an interesting point as to whether she'd be too left-wing for the Tory party today. But
I think she would be. Well,
I do think as well.
Winston Churchill's grandson was.
Yes. Obviously, I came into Parliament in 2010. Andrew had already been there for a term at that point, and I think, Andrew, if you asked, say the people who were elected at the same time as me on the Tory side, because that's when they came to power, if you explained to them 13 years on, because that's the length of time Labour was in power for, this is how the country would look, accounting for a pandemic, accounting for the war in Ukraine and what that's meant for energy prices in particular. I still think, notwithstanding those factors, most Tory MPs would be horrified at how the country looks and is after 13 years, where, look, the first 5 years was a coalition. They still got, economic policy-wise, everything they wanted from that. And so this is, they are accountable for the state of this country. Not for the consequences of Ukraine, but certainly for the health of the country going into these crises. And the resilience people have got, the huge rise in poverty.
I mean, like, libertarianism aside, like, isn't that the job of governments, is to protect its people? Whether it's from disease or from poverty or from foreign invading armies or whatever, it's to protect the people.
And actually, all MPs, irrespective of where on the political spectrum they come from, should have the same aims at heart, and that is to leave the country in a better condition than you inherited it. And we have different ideas about how we achieve that, but this government has monumentally failed on that basic
I think it's failed
principle.
on certain terms. I think it's failed on the terms that they said what they wanted to achieve in 2010. And I look at what we're putting forward, particularly, obviously, I deal more with the economic policy. Andrew's dealing with public services and health policy. But I think in any area, I mean, just on the business side of things that I cover, I think what we are putting forward in terms of long-term industrial policy, public investment to bring in more private investment, similar to how the Biden administration has been operating an incredibly innovative and significant policy in America. I think our points on making Brexit work, moving on from that argument, but delivering on a practical, good faith improvements in that relationship. We can talk about that. I know it's contentious, but I think it gets to the heart of a better relationship. I think the stuff we were saying on the apprenticeship levy, where we'd give businesses more flexibility to spend that on more forms of training, where we're talking about reform of business rates, these are genuine. They add up to a much more comprehensive offer on how to fix the problems we've got going.
I tell you what I was really impressed with. So Keir's missions, the 5 missions, actually incredibly ambitious in terms of that long-term vision of the kind of Britain after maybe 2 or so terms of a Labour government would create. But embedded in that is having the best sustainable growth in the G7. And, you might think, well, what does that mean? What that means is us being more prosperous over the long term with money that we can then plough back into our communities. Communities like Hyde and Stalybridge, communities like Denton and Reddish that have been absolutely decimated by 13 years of a Tory government. And that's the difference that it'll make. That growth is how you level up.
Rather than, sums of money. We were just talking to each other on the way here. So we've missed out on this levelling up fund money. I would say if you look at what the government was trying to achieve, it's communities like this that really need that.
Do you know how much Liverpool got from the EU's Objective 1 fund?
I imagine it's a considerable multiple than...
It was almost £2 billion.
Yeah, and you see that. I mean, I think Liverpool city centre in particular is really impressive.
Like
We've passed, both of us today, an advert in our own areas. The government essentially spending public money, pretending, politically campaigning for themselves on the fact that the town that neither of us represent has had that money. Ashton, I mean, Ashton deserves a good look, but they're so ignorant to the local area.
So that in Denton and in Hyde, they've got these big billboards with levelling up. And we, in Denton, have just lost out on the Levelling Up Fund. It's such an insult.
Hasn't Richmond been given like 19 million or something? Yeah.
I can't think why.
Is that Rishi Sunak's constituency?
It is. Yeah, it's funny you should say that.
What a funny coincidence. Pork barrel politics, I love it.
That's what it is.
We've become really Americanized. I was talking to AB about this on the way here. We were talking about how Trumpian everything is now. It just the lies upon lies. And there's a thing called the Gish Gallop where people speak, where you get interviewed and they say 6 lies in a row. Yeah. And you don't have time to respond to every lie before the interview's over. Yeah. So it's like that, but on another level now. And we played a game last night called Would They Lie to You? And we only had an hour, and we got through about 50 Tory lies that they just couldn't.
And if you do it with enough gusto, like Boris Johnson did, you know it's bullshit, you know it's bluster, but you want to believe it because, he said it can be, you can have your cake, you can eat it, everything's going to be great. And if they say you can't, they're talking down this country, they're,
talking down the country, yeah.
And You can't counter that. You can't counter that.
Do you think there's a need on the left, though, to sort of push for that kind of... you were saying about Keir's 5 goals, like to push to say, look, we can make Britain really great again.
You have to have that hope.
But without that slogan, different
It has to
tagline.
be believable. You know, people wanted to believe Johnson on his terms, but they knew deep down he's a charlatan and it's all lies. But they wanted to believe.
Well, the optimism, yeah. So my realistic non-Boris Johnson take on that would be, look, one of the problems in economic policy the country's got, well, economy's been basically stagnant for 10 or 15 years now. Yep. You've got really poor productivity. So how much is the economy producing every hour? You've got, because of that, you know, in real terms, wages have basically, they haven't moved as you would expect them to do every year. And yet, in the UK, you've got businesses, we've got examples around here, we've got some amazing employees in Tameside, great jobs. We have world-class stuff. We just don't have enough of it. You know, and what makes, say, you know, something like the Hyde Group is a very significant employer here in Tameside. What makes them so good? Well, look, they're well led, they've got a good workforce, they reward the workforce, they've got a good policy environment that supports them. You know, those are not ingredients that are somehow elusive. We can focus on what we do well as a country and say, why haven't we got more of that? And that's the kind of practical version. There is no reason why this country couldn't have an incredibly prosperous future. But at the minute, you know, the path we are on is not the one that's going to deliver that. And honestly, the biggest risk, I mean, to my constituency, to yours, I think to the country, a 5th Tory term. What will that mean? You know, how can more of this, when we've got that genuine, practical, serious alternative, you know?
Well, I've been recently, like, just reminiscing about the last time Labour were in power.
Yeah.
And how bloody great it was. I'm not saying this like be a bootlicker or anything, but I finished school in 1997. So imagine that. Like I finished.
Really old now.
I finished just as the Tories were kicked out, basically. And so I grew up under Clause 28. We weren't allowed to talk about homosexuality in schools at all. It was, you know, don't say gay. And then my school in Liverpool, I mean, it was a really good school, but the paint was peeling off the walls. We were using textbooks from bloody 15 years earlier. And then my friends after university, some of them did PGCEs, and then they went on to become teachers, and I was sometimes asked to come and give talks at the schools or whatever. And oh my God, in just sort of 5-6 years, the change.
Massively changed. And we've got to tell that story again because people have forgotten. And they're in the mindset now, and the Tories feed this, that, you know, however bad it is, you know, it's not going to get better. You know, and particularly with the NHS, that's what they want you to believe. It's broken. We can tinker around. We can try and get waiting lists down, but, you know, the system's broken and we probably need something, a radical change from the NHS that we know and love. And what I say to that is, firstly, we've got to tell people, remind them, the NHS has been on its knees before. In 1997, we had the longest waiting times in history then. We had the longest waiting lists in history then. Our NHS estate was crumbling. We didn't have enough doctors and nurses. And look, the Labour government, through reform and investment, transformed the NHS so that by 2010, we had the lowest waiting lists in history, the lowest waiting times in history, the highest patient satisfaction in history. You had a guarantee of seeing a doctor in 2 days. You know, what's a doctor?
It's now, isn't it?
Dentistry existed.
Dentistry on the NHS.
You know, and it was independently judged by the Commonwealth Fund as the second best healthcare system in the world. That's where Labour have left it.
Yeah.
And we can do that again. You've just got to believe and put the investment and the reform agenda there.
Yeah.
And the same's true with other public services as well.
I've been a Labour Party supporter my entire life, been a member of the Labour Party since I was 17. I will tell you honestly, because of the age we were at the time, did not appreciate just how significant that government was.
I know. It's like a lot of things. If you're in the middle of it, you don't appreciate
we're sat here in my
it.
constituency here. Like, just take one thing: the schools, right? I mean, the quality of the new build schools, Mosley Hollands up the road, Hyde Community School here, in where we are right now. I mean, amazing quality, right? You know, we Sure Stop we were one of the early places for that.
Yeah.
Essentially, trying to fix problems. Invest in areas,
And it was working.
every year since has felt like a situation where it's what is cut, you know. And I just want a politics where it's about how are we going to fix the problems here? No, what are we going to take away? And it's not about just spending money, like Andrew says. Reform was part of that.
Has to be.
We have a program. Andrew's teasing me this week because part of my constituency I used to be local councillor for. It's Hattersley. We're talking about urban regeneration, where we're in. Okay, there's lots of great examples of urban regeneration around the country, but you know, Hattersley was a place with a Manchester Overspill estate, so it was owned by Manchester, but it was in Tameside. Where that is today, it's just a much better place than it was in the past. Not perfect by any measure, but
I mean,
you know, a real advancement. It required the government not fixing everyone's problems, but being a partner, putting in some money so the councils, Manchester, Tameside, the Transport Authority, most of all local people, could drive that forward. But the support of government enabled that.
You get me onto public health now, because you know, for me, public health isn't just about making sure you don't smoke, don't drink too much, nanny statism. It's actually about tackling the social determinants of health, and that crosses every policy. It's literally cradle to grave, making sure you've got good start out in life, that you're school ready, that you have the best educational opportunities, that you have job opportunities when you come out of school or training. You've got the public transport to be able to get to where the
Make
jobs are.
public transport free, please. I went to the Fabian conference a few weeks ago. Johnny was there, and they did a talk, and Seb Dance was there, and they were talking about transport, you know, public transport and everything. And they talk about how much public transport costs. It doesn't cost anything, because for every pound you put into public transport, you get £10 back to the economy, because people can move about. You can't have social mobility without.
You can make that financial case to Rachel Reeves, but certainly what Andy Burnham's done here in Greater Manchester. So, you know, £1 fares or £2 all day fares has been transformational, and it has increased patronage on Manchester's buses for the first time in 40 years.
And also, like, I mean, we were both local councillors here in this borough in Tameside before we were MPs. You know, one of the most common experiences would be, because we obviously, certainly my council ward, Longdendale, was the sort of, it's the border with Derbyshire, right? So people know the geography, will get that. You would have a bus route taken away, and people would obviously be like, well, I depend on this, what can happen? And you could email and write to the bus company, but you couldn't really do anything. You know, there should be, it's a legitimate public interest in a good public transport system, right? That's why it's called public transport. And what Andy has done, and he's led the country in this, and it's one of the things I'm very proud of him as a Labour mayor, is, you know, bringing that kind of regulation of buses. It sounds a bit dull if people don't know, you know, but it's a huge issue. It is a huge issue, and it's required real political strength to drive it through.
As a northerner who has a particular interest in public transport, it just infuriated me for so long that in London, where it was all under TfL, you could buy one Oyster card, and it worked on the boats, it worked on the trams, it worked on the trains, it worked on everything, right? Up in the north here, if I'm waiting for the bus and it's a different company to the one I've got the bus pass for, I've got to wait another 20 minutes in the snow for the bus company or pay again.
That's why I'm a bit of a self-confessed, you know, transport policy nerd, right? And but the issue is, why does that work in London, right? Well, it works because, not just because you've got the control of the routes and buses and things like that, you have to find a way, obviously, if you know, you've both been on a journey, to how are you going to distribute that money between, you know, say the tram, the rail service, the bus route, and you do need that. No, that's what TfL can do, and they're very good at that. And I feel some of the arguments that, you know, Andy's had to make, we've had to make as supporters of him, are so elementary. You know, they're so basic. I don't. Again, I never think government, the state can fix everything, but I can look at what works better. And the fact that London's had this different on buses transport regime to us. We're not.
Well, they were never deregulated in London. The rest of England was, and that's chronically unfair.
And the amount per person that they spend in London on public transport is like in the thousands. Up in Newcastle, where I live, it's like 16 quid.
But people might say to us, and I would take this point, they'd say, look, the urban density of London's greater, so transport works. And I'd say, okay, but why has that been okay? Well, it's been okay because there is a transport system, right? So which comes first in a way? You can have flats where people don't need cars, and there's a transport system. It is very hard in our constituencies to be completely without car access. It genuinely is. And, that's before we even get into the state of the railways and Transpennine through. This week, Graham, it's been impossible to get into Manchester before 9 o'clock for some of my constituents.
Yes, I know. Well, I travel on the Transpennine from Durham to Liverpool a lot.
But you talk about in London, and of course TfL controls the whole network. TfGM will only have control of the buses and the tram. Andy's making the case to government that he wants what's called GM Rail as well, so you can piece it all together. Because the kind of journey that you mentioned, that myself and Johnny do when we're down in London, you can start your journey on London Overground, you can move on to the Underground, you can move on to bus, and you can finish it on cycle or on the river taxi, all using your Oyster card. And it all joins up. If you tried to do a similar journey in Manchester, people would have you signed up for the funny farm, because the trains compete with the trams, compete with the buses, and they all go into Manchester and they don't join up.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. One thing I wanted to mention as well, while you're here. So, back in the day, me and Johnny used to go to university together in Manchester, and one fine summer morning, I knocked around at Johnny's house and said, "Do you want to come to Glastonbury?"
That's right.
And I basically kidnapped him and took him to Glastonbury to go and see David Bowie.
David Bowie's headlining, and the Chemical Brothers on the first night.
Yes, that was pretty excellent. New deal for musicians. Bring that back.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the headliners of Glastonbury this year, and nearly everyone is from 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That's because you're not seeing the same young youth generation coming up and being able to get into music in a way that they could with the new deal for musicians.
Music in schools.
Oh God, yes, absolutely.
That's where it starts.
We subsidise private schools for their musical education, whereas in state schools you've got to pay for it.
I can remember, Graham, but the album everyone was listening to when I arrived in Manchester in 1998 when I was 18 was Gomez's Whipping Piccadilly.
Whipping Piccadilly, yeah.
T1 Lady, classic album. Bring It On, brilliant album. I actually met Tom Gray from Gomez recently, and he's a campaigner on this. He's a campaigner for better access to music and national music strategy. Also issues around, he runs the Broken Record campaign. So it's a lovely personal moment, but I think you're absolutely right. A key part of this in terms of what we're offering as well is the loss of creative industries' access to touring possibilities around Europe.
Yes.
And it's not just musicians, although that's clearly important. Here in Hyde, I've got a brilliant company that used to do a lot of the event transport. You say Elton John's touring in Europe, they'd move. Obviously under the terms of how we've left the European Union, the carny they would get would only give them 2 movements in Europe, whereas that's not a tour, is it? And there are things like that. And I know, look, it's an emotive argument, but there are practical ways, both economic and social, that we can improve that relationship. And that's what we're looking at. And I want to focus on that. I just want the chance to
Untapped oil is British talent. Like, we punch above our weight when it comes to TV, movies, media, music.
Brilliant soft power.
And yeah, exactly. And we just don't capitalise on it. But it's so, you talk about the video games industry. The video games industry in the UK is huge. It's comparable with Hollywood. That's
See, I'm stuck in the 1980s. I'm a big retro computer.
You have
Jet Set Willy.
Pretty much.
one of the most exciting I've ever had, but I'm going to go and see the people who make Football Manager, which is going to be a really important moment for me. What it's like when you finish in the week, you get on the train. As long as you can get on an Avanti train back to the northwest. A little bit of time, just escape from some of the reading we've got to do, some of the work. Fantastic.
My wife thinks I'm having a midlife crisis. So in lockdown, I got one of these remakes of old computers. So I got the VIC-20 because the VIC-20 was my first computer, and it's also got a Commodore 64 mode on it, and you can get all the games now on a little pen drive and stick it in. And I got bitten by the bug again, so I've actually bought a real second-hand VIC-20, and I'm I'm now buying all the kind of peripherals and all the old games on tape and on floppy disk, and my wife's just disowned me.
It's Glasgow, but Grand Theft Auto, which is one of the biggest, biggest video games in the world, that's a British game.
It is.
and like people don't know.
And a
this.
lot of them in the northwest. So Ocean, going back in the day, was a big software company based in Manchester.
Yeah, Psygnosis in Liverpool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Shadow of the Beast, baby.
Oh, brilliant! I had that on my Amiga.
This is getting really nerdy. Yeah, like
We've done transport. We're now doing computers.
train spotting straight to video games. But yeah, so looking back on the way our country was in the noughties, now I'm seeing, because obviously it was dominated by the decision to go to war in Iraq, and so now when people talk about Tony Blair, that's linked to that. And it's such a shame, because there were so many amazing things that Labour did back then. I think people just forgot.
And you've referenced Sure Start. I get so cross when I hear Tory MPs say that Sure Start was a quick fix that didn't work. It was never intended to be a quick fix. You tell me in 20 years' time, when the kids that have gone through Sure Start are then parents themselves, when the parents who went through Sure Start are grandparents, you tell me then whether it works. I had the massive privilege of opening a new Sure Start centre in the Duckingfield part of my constituency. Council estate, deck access flats, very white, very working class, and in the middle of the estate is a new built primary school built by Labour, and in that they had a Sure Start centre, and it had been open for about 6 months, but they had the official opening and they asked me to go along and do it. They introduced me to a lot of the users there and the staff, but there's two that stick in my mind. There was a young woman, and she was young, probably a teenage mum, and she was telling me that her life had been transformed by this Sure Start centre, because before it, her life was basically the four walls of her council flat in the estate opposite. Her kid basically was sat in front of the TV with a bag of crisps, mum in a dressing gown, and that was it. She was depressed. The health visitor kept trying to convince her to access different support. She wasn't interested. And eventually, one day, they got her across the door and into the Sure Start centre. She made friends with a young Asian lady from just across the river who lives in Ashton West End, which has a very big Bangladeshi and Pakistani community, and those two communities didn't mix. The Sure Start Centre became a safe space for these communities to come together. And she said, "Mr. Gwynne, can I show you my friend, my best friend, Amina? My daughter and her daughter played together here. I couldn't boil a pan of water before I came here. I'm now going to Amina's house and she's teaching me how to cook curry." And I just thought, if you could bottle this is what Sure Start is. It's not just about the kids, it's about the parents as well.
I have a real personal memory of it as well. So when I was first elected in 2010, Claire, my wife, was pregnant with our daughter Bess, named after Bessie Braddock, Liverpool MP. I remember, it was breastfeeding support, and it was delivered by the NHS, by a special person who had that role, delivered through the Sure Start centres. And I remember, it's one of those things that's quite hard at first, going around sort of day to day around. And I remember in one of them, I think it might have been in Ashton, sat next to this, and wife's getting the advice, and the guy's like, "You by any chance my MP?" And I'm like, "Yes." And I think that's what I'm a universalist. I think that's how public services should be. That you could be the MP, could be anybody, but you're there together, and but delivering it in a way which is a bit less formal than going to a hospital, or in where people need it, accessible, preventative. You see a lot, of course, as an MP, how the whole system works, and you look at how much money we spend. We intervene, say, extreme someone's in prison, or the justice system, or even like the healthcare system when acute need is there. A lot of resource goes into that. And I feel austerity took a lot of preventative services away. Sure start, great, what could have actually yielded a tremendous dividend. I mean, it's about the benefit to people, but if all you care about is the money, well, actually, I think it would have done that,
Also community. That's the thing, like, that's what I've felt in the last 13 years. There's been a massive breakdown in community. Not so much maybe in Liverpool, because Liverpool's always had that civic pride and everything. But there's been a thing where you used to go to the pub with your mates, and if you said something outrageously stupid, they'll be like, hey mate, wind your neck in, what are you talking about? Now, people aren't going to the pub. They sit on the computer and they find some idiot on the other side of the planet who believes exactly the same moronic nonsense that they believe. And they're like, I was right all along. So it's kind of like rebuilding those communities and putting that back together is such a
thing as society.
Yes,
there is such a thing as society, right? And I think one of the real ironies of David Cameron's time was, all that big society stuff. Well, actually, but the only real thing that he delivered was food banks, really. In terms of that agenda was based on food
brilliant.
Banks.
So, how many food banks were there at the beginning of the Tory term in 2010?
There were certainly not many in Tameside.
In my experience, they were mainly around a very specific set of circumstances around immigration status, and people had no recourse to public funds. The churches did that, and they have obviously evolved into any supermarket. You see the donation, cash, which is them doing the right thing, and people doing the right thing in response to need.
Great that they're doing it, but I want to live in a world where we don't need it.
We should seek their abolition.
We're the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. If we can't do it, no one can.
And in the 1930s, they called them soup kitchens.
Yeah.
It's basically what we've returned to.
So I'm 44, so I've had Tory governments in my life for 31 years, 30 more? 31 years. Right, and we're always skint. We had these few years when Labour were in the noughties, when suddenly we had money for stuff. We could afford short art centres, we could afford the new deal for musicians, we could afford...
We did fix the roof when the sun was shining.
We did fix
But
the
a core
roof.
part of that, right? People say, I understand when people say, because I talk a lot about it as the shadow business spokesperson, economic growth, does that benefit me? What is that? I mean, look, if I had to describe where the country's at the minute, I could talk about a lot of statistics, but I would say basically what gets me is, and what's the best way to describe it, we've got the first generation of British people who'll be less well off than their parents. So that classic working class story of wanting a better future for your kids. There's people looking at it and saying, I'm not sure they're
And
going to get
will
in the house.
die earlier than their parents as well.
They get the pension. That's disgraceful.
And it is. And this is a real moment of reflection. Do you want more of this? Or do you want it to go to something better? And I think, if the economy grows at, 2.5% a year, it means if you think because of compounding, it's doubling every 30 to 35 years. So 1%, which is, many years we've been under 2% under the Tories, historically bad performance. Well, if it's 1%, it's 70 years. So it's your grandkids, not your kids, who you're hoping for a better life.
And that's what that mission's about.
And that's what the mission's about. And that's why... I think we've got a load of interesting policies, specific proposals. I would say business rates, apprenticeship levy, industrial policy. I've got a plan for the steel industry, for the automotive industry. What you need to be able to explain to people is what's the big story you're telling, and that for us is that big story. I want
things to get better,
my
Johnny.
kids to be better. I want,
I want to leave a better world for my kids than I inherited from my parents. That's it.
Absolutely. And that's what we all want. I mean, I've been an MP now for 18 years, 13 in opposition, 5 under a Labour government. And I tell you, however hard being in government is, and you do sometimes have to make decisions sometimes that you would sooner not. It's far better being in government and changing people's lives for the better than shouting from the opposition benches.
I'd like that experience. You remember, again, you don't really appreciate it because you're too young, but you remember the phrase, the famous speech, John Smith, his last ever speech in public, the one where he says, the chance to serve is all we're seeking. I feel very much like that. I'm not saying every problem will go away under a Labour government. I'm not saying it will be harder because I recognise it would be
better, Johnny.
But the experience we've had here, we've been on this journey as councillors here, members of Parliament. We come home at the end of the week, talk to our constituents. try and fix those problems as casework. I just want the chance to not just be sending a letter to a minister.
I know. Saying,
I want to be saying, look, we
sympathy.
have got to fix this.
Yeah.
And the chance to do that is the chance to serve. I get what John Smith was really trying to get across in that. And it's incredibly poignant. That was John's last ever speech in public. But he knew what he was saying.
It's the thing with the Tories and the client press is that they want to portray all politicians as the same. And this drives me mad because you talk to people who are Conservative voters and you go, what about this thing? What about this? Yeah, but they're all the same. And I'm like, the level of corruption.
And it wouldn't be any better.
It wouldn't be any better. I really don't think that if Labour were in and they were giving VIP lane access for PPE contracts to their mates for millions of pounds, for PPE that didn't even freaking work, so it's putting people's lives in danger. Yeah, and would these same voters be like, oh, that's all right?
I mean, I always remember remember that famous thing, it was Jess Phillips gave a speech in Parliament where she said, I thought I'd made posh people, and I was elected to Parliament and came here, and I think most people in Parliament on all sides have gone for the right reasons, but you really get a sense of the difference between people like me and Andrew and some colleagues, just in terms of what their outlook, their experiences, what they are bringing. And I had a wonderful experience last week. A week ago, I was doing question time for the Labour Party. It was back in Sunderland. And it was in the fire station that my dad used to work in, which is now this amazing arts venue. And things have changed. It wasn't like literally sitting there as the fire engine is about to go out. And I mentioned that, people like applauded, and I was like, because they don't expect that, do they? They don't think, they think we're all hereditary, members of Parliament. And
I always think that, look, we're local. We mess up in London. It's a double-edged sword for us, because we've still got to come back at the weekend and look our friends, family and neighbours in the face. And that is an extra pressure to get it right down there and do the right thing down there. Because if we mess up, we haven't got villas abroad that we can go and hide away in. I've got to come home and look my wife in the face, let alone my neighbours.
I think especially in an urban constituency like here, and we're not the city centre of Manchester, obviously, but you can get around most bits of your constituency on a Friday, on a weekend. And so, it's not like, I was thinking if you had one of those enormous geographic constituencies, you could be in one village, no one would know in the next one. People do stuff, actually in a lovely way. People engage with you and tell you, most of our Saturdays we'll do an hour, at least hour and a half on the doorsteps, knocking on doors. That's what it is these days. I always amuse when people look, nostalgically back at politics. I mean, there's that famous story about Nye Bevan, tremendous, one of the greatest politicians and ministers this country's ever had. But I think he went back to his constituency once or twice a year, and there would be like a brass band, and the mayor would meet him. It's not what we expect coming home.
Where's my brass band?
Well, now, let me also say on that, we do have the oldest brass band in the country in Staley-Bridge, so we could do that, but not when you come back every Thursday. And that is, that is a part of the job. And I think, I wish more people wanting to get involved in politics, and I know it's a hard thing, social media and things like these days, but our local Labour group here is our councillors and things like that. They are just ordinary working people trying to make an improvement in the local area. And that's what politics is.
Some of the online stuff is vile. Why would you put yourself forward for public office with some of the abuse you get? And we see it with our colleagues as well, particularly female colleagues. I mean, they get it 10 times worse than we ever get.
That's true with them, influencers on the internet. Female influencers get so much more shit than the males. It just is. And the abuse they get is quite horrific. And it's got worse recently since Musk took over Twitter. It's like all the brakes have come off, and it's like a bloody jungle on there. I've given up Twitter. I've sworn off it.
You see people, they'll have in like the biography things like, be kind. And then you see them incredible abuse, and you're like, what are you not, but they're genuinely not connecting. And I think, like you say, I think, what we can do now, we can vote in Parliament, get out our phones, do a Facebook Live, we can do a video, we can do things like this. It's a huge asset, and I really appreciate that. But it has, I think, produced sometimes, people will say things. Sometimes you see someone say something online and you think, I know that person in real life.
Yeah, and they wouldn't say it to my face.
And they're quite a nice person. And I think as a society, like you say, it's not just politics, I'm talking about how people interact with each other, local issues, influences business. It's something to maybe think about, definitely.
Well, look, all I want at the moment, like I said, is just things to get better. And to quote D. Ream, I can't see it getting much worse. But then the Tories have a surprise every week, and it's like the bottom of the barrel. No, that wasn't the real bottom. That was a false bottom. Here's the real bottom.
I wonder whether people are they trying to play up to something they think will be popular, position them for a future Tory leadership contest, or do they really believe it? Because some of the stuff you see, it feels almost like a parody.
Yes,
it is. And actually, it would be nice to get, I don't ever want Tory governments, but I want the Tory party to be that sensible one nation party that historically they were.
I think it's gone.
I think you're right.
I would like in the next election for the Tories not just to be beaten. I want them to be destroyed. I want them to be ground to dust and blown to the four winds. I want the Lib Dems to be or even the SNP to be the official opposition. That'll move the Overton window back.
We want to win some Labour seats in Scotland as well, because the SNP record's not great there. But
Well,
I
you have to say that, John.
I think we can as well.
You only got one. Come on, mate. The only way is up from there.
Yeah, but
things can be better there too.
yeah, things can be better there too for the whole country. And I want this country to stay together. I think I think the change that could be so positive for the UK is that change to a Labour government. I understand, the alienation that at times has produced,
But the growth
action
you've
in
been
other places.
talking about that is embedded in Labour's plans is important for Scotland too.
It's hugely important. Hugely important.
I mean, it must be so frustrating for people in Scotland who've got all this energy coming out their ears. All the oil's up there, the gas is up there, the wind power is up there, and
What they need is to keep that. You develop those renewable resources in particular by linking that to the UK market, and actually for that renewable development. Part of the SNP's independence white paper was an argument for a UK-wide energy market,
Right.
Because obviously you take the bill payers, the customers in bigger numbers in England from there. You risk developing that, so it's a classic example of the shared interest, mutually beneficial. And I know the SNP will say, well, we'd keep that bit of the UK because we like that bit. Realistically,
I think
countries develop their domestic energy capacity.
I think what I would say at the moment is like, as I'm quite privileged. I'm white. I'm middle class. I speak English. I'm male. And yet I feel more powerless, I feel more powerless than I have ever, at any point in my life. And I feel like at this time when we've got the internet, we've got this two-way conversation going on, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whatever, and yet we're not being listened to because the people who have always been in charge are looking at me and calling me the metropolitan elite. Oh, mate, that makes steam come out my ears. No, Jacob Rees-Mogg calling me.
I mean, I shadowed Jacob Rees-Mogg for a while, and the first thing I'd say is, if you think, even sometimes people on the left of politics think, well, it's the Tories, they're born to rule. If you ever had any doubts, they have no idea what they're doing, and they're not very good at it. And you really do see that. And I think it goes back to that point. I think they're embarrassed where the country's at. I think they're looking for excuses, and that this dominates a whole range of the things you hear from the Conservative Party.
But it's everything
And
but them.
It's anyone but them.
It's global economics, it's the pandemic,
Oh yeah, it's never their fault.
I saw a Tory MP say this week, that people shouldn't vote for Labour because they want a disruptor to the establishment. And you're like, you've been in power not just for 13 years, for most of the last century.
Most of my life.
And this one. So I honestly believe the alternatives we're putting forward, the detail behind those, the intent behind those, I think it's better. I think we recognise we are not complacent. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to continue to bring people over. 2019 defeat was a very, very hard experience as a Labour candidate, no matter where you were in the country, even if you came through and won your own constituency. So there's a lot of work to do, but I feel more and more people want hope for the future. They want it to be better.
That's what I want. That's what I've been feeling. It's one of those things that's just keeping me going at the moment and keep me in this country, to be honest with you. Because I'm tempted to get in a small boat and just get the hell out of here. Get the hell out of Georgia, just go and live somewhere else.
What we need is a newspaper headline with a light bulb with Rishi Sunak's face in it, and will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Guys, thank you so much for joining me in the pub. Really good to see you.
Cheers.
Really good to see you as well. So that was PUBCAST, and we'll be doing a series of these for Labour Social. So join us in a couple of weeks for the next one. We'll see you there. Thank you.